Hello, my name is David Marler from Rotterdam, UAS, and welcome to this mini online lecture on British Attitudes and Identity for the course Culture and Literature 2, Introduction to Britain. Now, in this second mini lecture, you're going to be able to list specific aspects of the British class system and identify them to their corresponding attributes. You're also going to know about British identity with regards to religion and politics, and we're also going to talk about personal identity. Now, for the purpose of this web lecture, there are going to be a few questions that you're going to prepare to take to the online lecture. Now, here are the key terms that you can find in the syllabus that you're going to be able to answer questions on after this. It's very important to get out the syllabus and have a look at what is being discussed, and afterwards to check the ones that aren't discussed in the lecture. You, of course, have to remember that these will still be covered on the exam. Now, we're going to begin by talking about what identity is. And we're going to start by thinking about our own identity and how we make identity and how we as a society and we as individuals use identity. Now, the first thing is to understand that identity is a construct. And constructs are things that we, of course, make ourselves. It's a mixture of beliefs, personality, looks, expressions, and qualities of a person or group. So we all have identities. We can have basis identities, for instance, that we're man, woman, or we're non-conforming, we're cis or non-cis with regards to our gender. We also have racial identities, for instance, white, black, Asian, indigenous, etc. We also have nationalities, so we can have a national identity as being Dutch, English, or Scottish, for instance. We also have regional identities. So in the United Kingdom, we can talk about people saying that they're Northerners or they're Southerners. We have religious identities, like if you're Christian, Catholic, Muslim, Jew, etc. And then, of course, we also have socioeconomic identities, which is, for instance, rich people, middle class, poor, working class, etc. We can also identify basis of sexuality, for instance, gay, straight, bi. And of course, we also have different types of identities. So there are many other different aspects to this. For instance, your identity can be linked to your profession. You're all going to become teachers. Of course, that means that there's an aspect of your identity that's based on becoming a teacher. So right now I want you to take a few seconds to think about the identities, these kind of labels that you use for your own identity, and describe what the belief system, look, expressions, or various qualities of this group are. So we're going to look in this class at what we call tokens of Britishness. So a token is almost like a very superficial aspect of an identity. And in a lot of cases, sometimes people actually find these labels that we use for identity to be quite counterproductive, sometimes even constraining in our ideas of the way that we look at ourselves. But we're going to start by looking at these tokens of Britishness. We're going to start with the first question. So this question you're going to prepare, and of course you're going to bring it to your class discussion. And this is based on the Burns Night Supper. So you're going to open up your books to page 44, and you're going to read two opposing opinions on the Burns Supper. Burns Supper is, of course, a very stereotypical Scottish evening, supposedly, where you sit back and enjoy many different aspects of Scottishness. So you're going to look up and first answer the first question, what a Burns Supper is. You're then going to talk about what the realist thinks about many people who call themselves Scottish. And you're going to talk about the role that class plays in the realist ideas about Scottishness. And finally, the last question that you're going to answer is, what does the sentimental nationalist think Scottish people actually think of kilts and bagpipes? So I want you to pause the video right now, open up your book to page 44, and make sure that you answer these four questions. Once you're finished, unpause it, and we'll move on with the lecture. Okay, welcome back. We're going to look at some important symbols or tokens of the four nationalities. And these, of course, are very superficial aspects of British culture, but it is important to know them because when you recognize them in the future, it helps you better understand what they mean. First group that we're going to look at is the English. Now, the first thing to remember when we're talking about the English is that they're actually quite different from the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish in the fact that all of the other groups have a greater sense of national loyalty to their people. So Scottish people will definitely find themselves, in general, to be much more Scottish, and Welsh people will identify heavily as Welsh, and Northern Irish people as Northern Irish, or in many cases even just Irish. And the English don't necessarily have this loyalty, and that also makes sense because, as we can remember from previous lectures, the English make up a majority of the people in the United Kingdom. But there are some aspects of their quality, such as the bulldog spirit, which is this kind of very stereotypical British attitude towards life. So this idea of courage, determination, refusal to step down. Also, this keep calm and carry on. This idea of being in control of your emotions, being sometimes even cold, but definitely stern and having resolve. Also, this stiff upper lip. That's what we mean. Not the quivering lip or the sentimentalist, or in many cases the emotional or sometimes superficial American. The British are very straightforward. However, it is important to note that in recent years, a lot of sociologists have seen that being English is becoming more and more important. Now, the next country that we have is, of course, the Scots, Scottishness. And there are several reminders of Scottish individuality or Scottish difference, some of these tokens. One of the biggest ones is, of course, that Scotland has structurally many different systems of education and government that are completely different from England and Wales. And you'll hear this a lot on the BBC. If they're talking about educational reform, they'll say the exams for England and Wales, because Scotland actually runs things very different. They also have a different language. Now, the first language is, of course, Scots, which is actually a Germanic language very similar to English. And of course, you have Scottish Gaelic, which is a completely different language, much closer related to, for instance, the Gaelic that's spoken in Ireland or Irish. Scots also have their own banknotes. They have their own money. And of course, they have different types of tokens of Scottishness that we've talked to before. For instance, of course, bagpipes, kilts, different foods, haggis. But there is a big difference between the Highland and the Western Isles, which is more Gaelic, and the Lowlands, which is more Scottish or English. The next one that we have is, of course, Welsh identity. And the Welsh society is generally largely organized as the same as English society, as I said. So the government, education, etc. It's almost identical. But there are some big tokens, generally historical tokens of Welshness. And it's also important to note that a lot of these are based around the Welsh language. The first one is, of course, Owen Glyndwr, who was a Welsh leader who instigated a fierce and long-running but unsuccessful war of independence with the English who had ruled Wales during the late Middle Ages. And he is the last official Prince of Wales who is Welsh. A lot of this is based actually on their Welsh language, and it's important to know that of all the areas where Celtic is spoken, there are several of these areas. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, in Scotland. We also have in Ireland, and of course there are even parts of Cornwall. We're not quite sure how many people actually still speak the language in Cornwall. And then, of course, there is also a small area in France where Celtic languages are spoken. But Wales is actually the only place where there are successful, somewhat large numbers of people who actually speak the language, much more successful than in, for instance, Scotland or Ireland, where the amount of native Celtic-speaking people, so Gaelic-speaking people, is much smaller. Now, that has to do with a lot of things. First off, there's just a large group, especially in the north of Wales, who speak the language. But there is also a governmental push for this kind of revival of the Welsh language, making it be more important for Welsh people. And of course, one of those is that signs have to be made in both English and Welsh. And you see this throughout Ireland also. Now, my favorite is this picture right here. It was on the BBC. That, of course, it's into an industrial estate. It says no entry for heavy goods vehicles, residential site only. And of course, then you have that in Welsh. But the problem was that they sent it to a Welsh translator, and what they got back was an out of office response. So the Welsh sign actually says, "I am not at the office at this moment. Send any work to be translated." And of course, because the people making the signs, although in Wales, speak no Welsh whatsoever, this then led to a very embarrassing situation for the Council of Swansea in Wales. So it is important to notice that 19% of the Welsh population actually speaks Welsh, and this is actually this is quite large. We also have other ethnic identities that are in the UK that are not necessarily English, but that are kind of developing alongside English and British culture. One of them is Black Caribbeans, and these we often refer to. We don't always refer to them as this, but a large group of them are what we call the Windrush immigrants, and these are immigrants that came from Trinidad and Jamaica, often to do low-pay work after the Second World War. Demographically, they are very close to white Brits with regards to their religion, so Christianity, and also often non-religious aspects and language. But they do have their own practices, they do have their own food, etc. So culturally, the people from the West Indies and from the Caribbean in the UK have a very different but also very treasured culture that is also not necessarily the same as it would be in, for instance, in Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago. We also have people from the Indian subcontinent, so these are people that are from Pakistan, what we now call Bangladesh, and India, which were all parts of the British Empire. And what we see is that a lot of these people often marry within their own ethnic and religious group, and that there is cultural friction between the role of the family and control between the group you were born into and the rest of society. Now, we're going to come back to a lot of these groups because later, when we cover contemporary British literature, we're going to be reading the novel Brick Lane by Monica Ali, and we're going to really be looking at Bengali culture in London. We also have another aspect of identity in the UK, and that is geographical identity. So language and accent are often based upon geographical location, and this is especially the case in England. And there's an actual line where people start using the term northern, and it's actually not that north in the UK. But it goes deeper, because often identity is linked to where you're from. So for instance, we have certain words that we use, like Newcastle, we of course know from Geordie Shore. Liverpool, called the Scousers, Manchester, they're Mancunians. We have London with the Cockneys, and there is, of course, this very strict north-south divide. A lot of times with regards to ideas of work ethic, intelligence, appreciation for culture, there's a definite divide between the north and the south. And you're going to be asked to look at this in your book and describe the greater divisions between the north and the south. Another one that we can look at is the role of the family. Now, the role of the family in the UK is very similar to that in the Netherlands. Family is important, but large extended families are not considered to be as important to English people. You have a low responsibility to your family or to your group, and that is because the UK, like many Western European countries, is highly individualistic. So one of the questions that you're going to look at now is whether you think corruption is less evident in individualistic cultures because of this. Now, finally, there are some texts that we did not cover on the chapter on identity, and that is, of course, talking about class, men and women, Northern Ireland, being British, and sense of humor, because these were all topics that we covered last year. However, you do have to know them for the exam, so make sure that you cover them. Okay. The next topic that we're going to discuss is British attitudes towards multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism can be defined primarily and sociologically in two ways. The first way is a salad bowl, and a salad bowl means that you have a society with a bunch of cultures together that mix together, but you can still see each individual piece each individual culture, much like you would with a salad. So you can have the lettuce being one group, the tomatoes, etc. The melting pot is a little bit different. The melting pot is based on assimilation. It means that all of these different pieces come together, they're melted into a totally new culture. Now, after World War II, the demographics in the United Kingdom drastically changed. Now, this isn't necessarily true because you can actually look at, for instance, after the potato famine in Ireland, that there was a massive influx of Irish people into the UK. We also have the same with people that came from the colonized countries that were there much earlier. But after the Second World War, we have a large group of people entering. If you remember earlier in the lecture, we talked about, for instance, the Windrush generation. And there are issues right now in the UK with regards to tolerance and acceptance. And a lot of what we'll discuss later in this course is, for instance, when we talk about the Brexit, there is a certain amount of animosity and xenophobia that actually led to the Brexit. So it's always important to compare countries with other countries that are around them. And the majority of you, almost all of you, live in a country that is a border country with the United Kingdom, so to speak. And it's good to then see what the general Dutch idea is to multiculturalism and to compare that with the way that the British look towards it. And also to look at the role that multiculturalism and xenophobia played with Brexit, because there's also a large push that says while not everyone in the UK is necessarily xenophobic, but that these kind of insecurities, economic and social insecurities that have come with the end of the industrialization of the United Kingdom, so the UK moving from an economy based where they made a lot of things to a service-based economy, that's led to a lot of animosity towards people, especially people from Central and Eastern Europe. Another attitude to look at is the attitude towards intellectualism. And it's good to kind of also see that this may be something that's a little bit different in the Netherlands when compared to the UK. Generally, we can see that the British are not necessarily the most positive towards intellectuals, so people that are openly intellectual. And it's also good to look at your own ideas about this. In general, we can say that the British population is quite anti-intellectual, and open intellectual remarks are seen as being quite pretentious. And also compare this to the Dutch, what Dutch people think. The big differences between someone like Maarten van Rossum, who's a very clear intellectual, and the way that they compare this to anti-intellectuals. The next question that you're going to look at is how intellectualism is regarded in Dutch culture and if this is the same as it is in British culture. And for this, you're going to look at your textbook. One of the other aspects that we're going to be talking about today is, of course, formality versus informality. And I think that this is actually one of the biggest differences between British culture and, for instance, Dutch culture. And you can see that in the Netherlands, the culture is almost always informal. And this is the case in a lot of Western European, Northwestern European cultures, excluding, of course, the UK. So, for instance, what do you think that the Dutch think about the style of clothes that a person should wear? And also, what do you think that the Dutch think about cursing in public? Now, with both of these, we can say that, for instance, especially if we look at the college where I teach, that I can almost wear any type of clothes that I wanted to work, so a t-shirt and jeans. This is totally acceptable attire, and no one would think of you as any less. And we can definitely say the same things about the places where you, possibly your internship, you go to a school, you can really don't have to think that much about the clothes that you wear. You, of course, want to have clothes that are appropriate, but wearing a t-shirt is not unheard of. You could say the same things also about some of the most prestigious universities in the country. You'll see some people wearing suits and ties, but overall, people are quite free with what they're allowed to wear. And Dutch businesses also have this. There are with finance, there's maybe a culture of formality, but in a lot of businesses, there's this kind of startup mentality where people can wear whatever they want. And it's also considered to be, gauche to judge people based on the clothing that they wear. And one of the things that I found very shocking when I moved to the Netherlands was for instance, the cursing in public. The fact that I would work at a school and I would have pupils and now students who use language that is totally unacceptable. Now, this is primarily because I come from an English-speaking country, and a lot of the culture that I have is based upon the English and the British culture that we received. And that is because in the UK, there are generally two different kind of sides to every situation. There's the formal situation, which you'll see at a lot of people's work, with people that they don't know, when you go to shops, etc. And this is, of course, we see as being professional. So there's a high amount of formality, and there are rules, the way that someone dresses, the way that someone speaks, the tone in their voice, etc. And then we have this informal or personal setting where there's very low formality. So it's really, it may be a stereotype, but it's not unheard of to see a British person who works at a bank on a Friday during the day, dressed impeccably, going to a financial institution in the city in London, and then 5-6 p.m. hits, they go home, they put on a t-shirt and jeans, and they go out possibly drinking. They drink a lot, of course. Then once they're there, they can be around their friends. They can use pretty much whatever language they want, cursing. For Dutch people, this is definitely not the case. They can talk to their colleagues at work in the same way that they would talk to their friends at home. And so this is sometimes a shocker to people from English-speaking cultures that then realize that this informality is something that they really have to get used to. And that's something that you want to talk about in question 3, which, how are these two faces different? How should one behave, dress, or act in these different situations? So I want you to make a list for question 3 of what you found in the book and the different ways in which the formal and informal societies work. Now, finally, I want to go over the topics that we didn't cover in class today, and that's because these are things that you still have to look up for the exam. So we didn't talk about class, the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, religion and politics and social identity and social climbing, primarily because we covered this last year in Culture and Literature 1.2. So you have now 3 questions that you're going to work on, and you'll be expected to have them finished by the time that you enter the web lecture. Thank you for listening.